Hey, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the abolitionist movement and the role of women in the early abolitionist movement. We're going to focus a little bit on what the goals of the abolitionist movement were, and I'm using the word abolitionist. You all should know that that just refers to women who were fighting against slavery. So the goal was to end slavery in the United States if you were an abolitionist. So we'll talk a little bit about the goals of the movement, some key abolitionists. We'll talk a little bit about strategies and tactics, and of course, how the abolitionist movement gets us one step closer to understanding the rise of the early women's movement, the first wave of the women's movement. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the forms that the work of abolitionists took, and why the protest methods used by women were different from the ones that were used by men. We talked a little bit about this last week when we said we needed to look at the economic, political, and social conditions of women during that time to understand how their tactical approach to thinking about abolition was different. And then we'll also have an opportunity to explore some of the ways in which the activism of Black and white women were different during this time period, and of course, what contributed to those differences. So, again, abolitionist work was the work of abolishing or ending slavery. And basically, during this time period, and we're talking about time period from about 1787 up until about 1865, when slavery was abolished in the United States, is the time period that we call the abolitionist era. And basically, in 1787, states were allowed to decide whether or not they wanted to allow slavery. So by the early 1800s, slavery had ended in most of the northern states, but slavery still existed in the southern states. So you all might be aware of that whole idea that slavery existed in the South and not in the North. There was a time when there were slaves in the South and the North. The North decided early on to end slavery, whereas it continued in the South. So much of the abolitionist work we'll be talking about is occurring in the southern states. Typically, when we talk about the abolitionist movement, we're looking at two perspectives on how folks were thinking about doing this work of freeing the slaves. On one hand, there was a distinction between what we call the gradualist and the radical abolitionists. The gradualists were thinking about stopping the spread of slavery in a more gradual way, for lack of a better word. They weren't looking to eradicate slavery immediately, unlike the radical abolitionists who demanded unconditional emancipation at that moment. Gradualists often advocated for repatriation, free Blacks to Africa, meaning that it would be a way of eliminating slavery in the United States, but it would also be a way of making sure that you did not have a population of free Blacks living in the United States. So it's free the slaves, but we don't necessarily want the slaves living in our country. This movement was also known as the colonization movement. Slaves were, as they were being freed, were actually being moved to Liberia between the time period from about 1820 to 1850. So if any of you are familiar with that movement or the understanding of the Liberian culture, it was basically the product of about 20,000 freed slaves who were sent to Liberia as a part of the gradualist abolitionist movement. So, of course, it's always interesting to ask questions such as, why do you think this distinction in perspectives on ending slavery existed in the first place? So this is a good opportunity to think about what race and race relations and racism looked like during this time, and that you can even have folks that were seeing slavery in itself as immoral which many people did. They thought it was ethically a huge problem in the United States, but people were not necessarily ready to face the real truths around race. And I think the abolitionist movement, or the gradualist movement in particular, demonstrates that. Um, so reformers actually started realizing that the gradualist approach to ending slavery was not ending slavery very quickly. And we actually saw that slave populations were increasing during this time period because of the cotton boom in the South. There was an increased dependence on slave labor. And at that point in time as well, the slave population was increasing in the United States because of the emphasis on procreation. The whole idea was um, raise more slaves, give birth to more slaves in the United States, so that people would not have to move through this middle passage, which was the process of actually bringing slaves from Africa to the United States. And in that process, many folks died in the middle passage. So even as a part of the economics of the slave economy, it was breeding slaves in the United States, if you will. It's always interesting talking about slavery and this time period, as we have to consider the real atrocities of slavery. But as I present this information, I always like for you to consider and think about the ways in which change is a process that takes a long time. We were talking about slavery as a very ingrained institution in the United States, and it took 100 years for abolitionists to actually reach the goal of the 100% eradication of slavery in the United States. But all of these movements that we'll be discussing clearly represent the ways in which social change is nothing that happens easy. And especially when women are at the forefront of social change, it really doesn't seem to happen easy. Many of the change movements that we'll be talking about are things that you will see we are still contending with. When we talk about labor rights movements, when we talk about birth control movement, you're going to see some of the same issues being discussed today that we were talking about in 1800 in the early 1900s. So just to warn you about that now, change is a process and sometimes an ongoing one. So I wanted to introduce a few abolitionists that were pretty paramount in the development of the abolitionist movement. And I want to start with William Lloyd Garrison, who, although is not a woman advocating for social change, was really important as we think about the ability for women to become social change advocates. William Lloyd Garrison was a radical abolitionist, very known for starting an anti-slavery newspaper called The Liberator in 1831. And he was actually one of the first abolitionists to call for the immediate ratification or end of slavery. He was also the originator of the American Anti-Slavery Society that started in 1833 and grew to have more than 1,000 chapters by 1838. But one of the reasons that William Lloyd Garrison is so important for us to talk about in relation to understanding the abolitionist movement and the role of women in it is because his newspaper, The Liberator, provided a space for women to be able to have their opinions known, their political voices heard. Up to this point, women were not seen politically. Very few women were actually writing and having their thoughts and their stories told and presented to the public. But even more than that, women were not seen as public figures. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. as we start looking at the number of women that started to speak out against slavery. And this was actually quite a taboo for women as well. Not only were women not to be publishing their thoughts, but women were definitely not to talk about their political thoughts in public settings. So, thinking about a newspaper, The Liberator, that provided a space and a voice for women, white women, African American women, to talk about the atrocities of slavery and the immorality of slavery was quite radical and revolutionary for this time. So the next thing you're going to do is you're going to watch a video clip of William Lloyd Garrison to learn a little more about